This is for the digestive system. The digestive system is basically one long tube, starts at the mouth, ends at the anus. This long tube is called the alimentary canal. Now, the purpose of the digestive system is to take the food stuff that you ingest, chew up, and swallow, and break it down into its smallest individual molecules so that you can absorb it into your body, because these are going to be the building blocks to make your proteins or to store your sugars or to make your fats. And then whatever is not being absorbed will be eliminated as residues. So let's work our way through the digestive system. There are 4 tissue layers when it comes to the walls or the tissues of the alimentary canal. The one that's on the inside, which means it's the deepest layer, and this is the layer that is closest to the foodstuff as it passes through the alimentary canal, that is known as the mucosa. And then the layer underneath that, which is heavily vascularized, that is the submucosa. And the next layer is a muscle layer called muscularis externa. And there are 2 layers of muscle. There is going to be this inner circular layer, and then there's an outer longitudinal layer. The inner circular layer is for mixing up food stuff as it passes through the alimentary canal, and then the longitudinal layer is responsible for a type of movement called peristalsis. And peristalsis is a wave-like pattern of movement to propel foodstuff forward towards the end. And then the very last tissue layer, which is really thin, especially compared to the others, is called the serosa. So we're going to look at parts of the mucosa, and then we'll look at parts of the submucosa for this slide. This is showing you a section of the small intestine. So we're going to start on the left-hand side right here in a second, and then we're going to work our way around clockwise. As I start labeling these slides, hopefully you've already labeled yours and you can check them or check it against your work. I'm going to start on the left-hand side like I said I was going to. I'm just going to write the first letter or a few letters of whatever we're pointing to. For example, the first thing we're pointing to is called a Peyer's patch. So P for Peyer's and then P for patch. This is basically a lymph node of sorts. It helps cleaning the blood and the lymph as it passes through the intestinal system. This next line is pointing to a muscle. This muscle is a really thin sheet of muscle, and it is a part of the mucosa layer. This is called the muscularis mucosae. This layer helps keep the inner lining, or it keeps the alimentary canal kinked, because you have like 16 feet of intestines all in your gut, so it's all coiled up over and over again. But the muscularis mucosa keeps it coiled. This next line is pointing to a lymphatic capillary that's located in each villus, and this is called a lacteal. A lacteal is absorbing the fats that have been absorbed through the lumen. And then the next line is pointing to a villus. If you stuck a finger straight up in the air, that's what the villus would look like. So each one of these is one villus, and they've colored them on the outside kind of a puke green color. And then we can see all the cells that line on the outside. The cells that are on the outside, those are the simple columnar cells. So these are the absorptive enterocytes. Anything that's in the lumen that wants to be absorbed into the circulation has to go through these absorptive enterocytes. This is the simple columnar epithelium. The next line is pointing to some capillaries. Inside of the core of each villus, we're going to have a lacteal for the fats, and we have capillaries to help absorb the amino acids and all the sugars that have been absorbed through the intestinal lining. And then this next line is pointing to cells that dip down towards the muscularis mucosae, and these are called crypts, C-R-Y-P-T-S. They are intestinal crypts. These cells are producing mucus, which has a bicarbonate in it, which is for a buffer, and these cells also produce a water secretion, saline secretion, and it also produces hormones. Now we're going to start looking at some organs inside of the abdomen. We're going to start down here in the lower left. We're going to look at this line and keep going around clockwise, and then on this side to this line, to that one, to that one. And again, I'm going to use the first letter or few letters at each line. This first arrow is pointing to the large intestine. But there could be two possible answers for this. It could be the large intestine, but it also could be the cecum. The large intestine is separated into different regions, and the very first region of the large intestine that receives the foodstuff from the small intestine is the cecum. The cecum is a small pouch. Then we go up, and this next line is pointing to the small intestine. Now there are three parts to the small intestine. They're called the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. Specifically, this is pointing to the jejunum, but if it's pointing to this on the test, they just want to know that you know it's the small intestine. This next line is pointing to a part of the large intestine. Another term for the large intestine is called the colon, and the colon has different parts to it. The cecum is part of the colon. Then we have an ascending colon, transverse colon, and a descending colon, which leads to the sigmoid colon, which leads to the rectum. This next line is pointing to the transverse colon. Transverse is like a horizontal line across the abdomen. So that is the transverse colon. This next line is pointing to the largest internal organ, which is the liver. The liver is receiving the blood. It stores the nutrients that have been absorbed from the intestines and the stomach. These nutrients come through the hepatic portal venous system. This next line is now pointing to your stomach. The stomach's in the upper left quadrant of the abdomen. The liver, on the other side, is in the upper right quadrant of the abdomen. And then this next line is pointing to the mesentery. mesentery. This specifically is known as the greater omentum, but don't worry about that. This is the mesentery. And then this next line is also pointing to the large intestine. It's pointing to the colon, but specifically it's pointing to the descending colon because it's going down. It's going towards the sigmoid colon, which would be the next part of the large intestine. All right, so cecum is right here. This is the part of the large intestine, but that's specifically the cecum. All of this right here is the small intestine. It does go over here, but what they're showing you on this right-hand side is the mesentery, the fatty tissue, which forms like an apron in front of the intestines. But this is the small intestine over here. And then right here is pointing to the transverse colon. It is part of the large intestine. Transverse colon because it goes in the transverse horizontal direction. This organ up here is the liver. This organ over here is the stomach. And then this line is pointing to the mesentery, or the greater omentum. And then this line right here is pointing to the descending colon. Well, there's only two lines in this one, so it's easier to see some things. The liver has been removed so that we can see deep inside of the abdomen. Now we can see the right kidney and the right adrenal gland. But on the left-hand side, I want to know what this is specifically. We're talking about this band in the very center right here. If you remember when we were going over the layers of the intestinal wall, in the second slide, the layers were the mucosa, submucosa, the muscularis externa, and the serosa. There are two layers to the muscularis externa. There was a circular layer and a longitudinal layer. The longitudinal muscle layer in the large intestine has a specific name, which is why I want to know specifically what it is pointing to. It is pointing to the longitudinal muscle in this transverse colon, but specifically it's pointing to the tinea coli. And tinea is spelled T-E-N-I-A-E. Sometimes it's spelled T-A-E-N-I-E. But anyways, tinea coli. That is the name of the longitudinal muscle of the large intestine. Now this line that's on the right-hand side is pointing to the stomach, like it was in the previous picture, which is in the upper left quadrant. All right, in this picture, we've removed the stomach and we've removed the transverse colon. Now we can see part of the small intestine called the duodenum or the duodenum, either way, and now we can also see the pancreas. The pancreas is an endocrine and an exocrine organ, which is why we looked at it in the endocrine system. There are little islands of cells called pancreatic islets, and they have alpha cells and beta cells. They produce glucagon and insulin to help regulate your blood sugar. It'll raise your blood sugar in between meals, and then it lowers your blood sugar right after you eat a meal. But that is the pancreas right here. Then here is the small intestine. Specifically, it is the duodenum. All right, we're going to start with this line, and then we'll label this one, and then end up with that one right there. right, so first up, that first line is pointing to the colon. All right, it's also known as the large intestine. This is also the cecum. So it's the large intestine, it's the cecum, it's the colon, all the same thing. Now this next line is pointing to the jejunum. So earlier, if we're pointing to it, it could just say small intestine. But they could ask you more specifically what is at this line, and that would be the jejunum. The next line is pointing to the duodenum or duodenum. I've heard them both ways, but duodenum is the more common way. And then this line on the right-hand side is pointing to the pancreas. That is the organ that's producing the glucagon and the insulin to regulate your blood sugar. All right, in this picture, we've removed the stomach, the liver, and the small intestines. We've also removed the transverse colon. So now we can see different parts of the large intestine. So we're going to start with this line right here, pointing to this green lymphatic structure, and then we'll go to this structure, and then we'll go to this structure, and then go over here on the right-hand side to label that, and label that one. All right, so on the bottom left-hand side, that is pointing to the appendix. You can see the appendix two different ways. Just the appendix, or it could say vermiform appendix. Vermiform means that it's vestigial, and it means it's not necessarily needed. But it is a lymphatic organ, so it does have some function. Do we need it? Not really, but it does have a function. So the appendix, that's the first line. And the next line is pointing to the cecum again. There's one part here I wish that they had labeled, and maybe it's on a slide later, and if so, I'll kick myself. But right there in that circle that I just made, that is showing this valve. This is a valve that is between the small intestine and the large intestine, and it is called the ileocecal valve. All right, continuing around, this next line is pointing to the ascending colon, because this is where the colon goes up. Now look at the right-hand side. This is the first line at the top. That's the descending colon, because the colon is moving down. This next line is pointing to the very last section of the small intestine before it empties into the large intestine. This is called the ileum, I-L-E-U-M, not I-L-I-U-M, that's a bone. And then this last line is pointing to the sigmoid colon. Sigmoid colon kind of forms an S shape, and that is right before the large intestine becomes the rectum. Basically, second verse, same as the first. We're looking at some of the same digestive organs, but the model's a little different, and the colors are a little different, and it's a little smaller. So that's why I put this one in the PowerPoint in case it's on the test. All right, we'll start on the left-hand side, this bottom line. That is pointing to the very first part of the large intestine, which is known as the cecum. So that is pointing to the cecum. The next line is pointing to the section of the colon after the cecum, and that is the ascending colon. All right, the next line is pointing to the small intestine. Small intestines are surrounded by the large intestine, the colon. All right, this next line, speaking of the colon, is pointing to the tinea coli. That is that strip of longitudinal muscle in the very center of the large intestine. The next line is pointing to where the gallbladder would be, G-A-L-L-B-L-A-D-D-E-R. Bile is produced by the liver. Bile is transported into the gallbladder, where the gallbladder will condense the bile by absorbing some of the water off of it. And then bile is dumped into, no pun intended, into the small intestine to help emulsify and break down fats. But the gallbladder is in the upper right quadrant, and it's right behind the liver. The next line is pointing to one of the lobes of the liver. There are 4 lobes to the liver. The largest lobe of the liver is the right lobe. So the right lobe of the liver is the next line. And then the next line is pointing to the left lobe of the liver. All right, now on the right-hand side, and the line on top, that is pointing to the stomach, upper left quadrant of the abdomen. This next line is pointing to the transverse colon. All right, continuing down, this next line is pointing to the descending colon. And then this next line is pointing to the sigmoid colon. This slide focuses on some of the structures that are in the posterior wall of the abdomen, still a part of the digestive system, and some of it's part of the alimentary canal. We'll start on the left-hand side on the line that is on the bottom and work our way around to the top. This first line is pointing to a specific part of the pancreas. There are 3 parts of the pancreas. There's a head, then there's a body, and then there's a tail. This line is pointing to the head of the pancreas, which sits in the crook or the curve of the duodenum. The next line is pointing to the body of the pancreas. That is going to be most of the pancreas. The pancreatic duct goes right through the center of the pancreas body. The next line is pointing to the bile duct. The bile duct is a shared duct between the gallbladder and the liver. This common bile duct goes down and empties into the duodenum. This line at the top is pointing to the esophagus. The esophagus is the tube or part of the alimentary canal that goes from the pharynx. It goes behind the larynx, through the thoracic cavity, through the diaphragm, and leads to the stomach. This next line is pointing to the tail of the pancreas. So we had the head of the pancreas, then we had the body of the pancreas, now we have the tail of the pancreas. This next line is pointing to part of the small intestine. This specific part of the small intestine is called the jejunum. The first part of the small intestine is the duodenum, which is that last line. The duodenum is short and it is fixed compared to the rest of the small intestine. The second part of the small intestine is the jejunum. As soon as the duodenum curves around and underneath the pancreas, it becomes the jejunum. All right, let's point those out with the laser pointer. All right, so here is the head of the pancreas right here. And right here is the body of the pancreas. This green vessel right here is the bile duct. And then this tube up here is the esophagus. And then this part of the pancreas is the tail. And then this part of the pancreas, this isn't the pancreas. This part of the small intestine is the jejunum. And then all of this right here, that's the duodenum, the very first part of the small intestine. This slide is pointing to a couple of our salivary glands. We have 3 main salivary glands that are producing saliva, which is a secretion that is used for digestion. Some saliva is very serous, which means it's very full of enzymes, it's thin and it's watery. Some saliva is very thick and it's a binding mucousy type of saliva. So you have your teeth to chew up food, and the saliva to help break it down on a molecular level, and then more saliva to help keep it together as you swallow it. All right, this upper left line is pointing to the largest of the salivary glands, and it's known as the parotid or parotid salivary gland. There's a duct that leads into the cheek. The parotid salivary gland is the gland that can be infected with the mumps, and it makes you look like a chipmunk because your parotid salivary glands will swell up. And then we have the other line on the right-hand side that is pointing to the submandibular salivary gland. So parotid salivary gland is anterior to the ear. Submandibular salivary gland is underneath or deep to the mandible. All right, structures of the half head. Some of these same structures we looked at in the respiratory system, so this could be a little bit of a review for some things. We'll start on the left-hand side on the bottom and work our way around clockwise. This line down here is pointing to the esophagus. The esophagus is the tube that brings the food and liquid stuff that you have swallowed to the stomach. This next line we looked at in both the lymphatic and the respiratory system. Those are the lingual tonsils. This next line is pointing to the oral cavity. So as soon as you put something past the lips, it's inside of the oral cavity. Teeth are found inside the oral cavity. Salivary gland ducts are located in the oral cavity, and the tongue is located in the oral cavity. Speaking of which, this next line is pointing to the tongue. That is a muscle that keeps the food between the teeth as you chew. Hopefully the tongue clears the teeth so you don't bite it. Speaking of teeth, this next slide is pointing to the teeth. The teeth are used to grip and grasp the food and then to grind it down and some mechanical digestion. Mechanical digestion is breaking down using physical forces. Chemical digestion is breaking something down at the molecular level, breaking the bonds. So using your teeth to chew the food up, that is a mechanical digestion. All right, this next line is pointing to the maxilla, which is the upper jaw. This is also the hard palate. All right, remember the palate is the roof of the mouth. We have a soft palate and a hard palate. All right, the right-hand side, this upper line is pointing to the palatine bone. We looked at that when we looked at the skull. So palatine bone is right there. Right beneath it or behind it, that is the soft palate. That's going to be soft tissue like muscle. At the very end of the soft palate, we looked at this in the respiratory system, that is the uvula. Whenever you swallow, the soft palate lifts and blocks off the nasal cavity and the nasal pharynx so that whatever you swallow goes down and not up through the nose. The next line is pointing to some tonsils. These are the palatine tonsils. And then the next line is pointing to part of the pharynx. This is the oropharynx. And then this last line is also pointing to part of the pharynx. This is the laryngopharynx. All right, so esophagus is right here. Lingual tonsils, right here. Oral cavity, right here. Tongue, right here. Teeth, right here. Maxilla, right here. Hard palate also. Palatine bone, right here. Soft palate, right here. Uvula, right here. The palatine tonsils, right here. Oropharynx, right here. And then laryngopharynx, right here. All right, let's look at some parts of a tooth. We'll start at this upper line right here, and then we'll label this line, and then this line. The line at the very top, that is pointing to a tissue called the enamel. Enamel is on the outer surface of the crown of the tooth. The crown of the tooth is the part of the tooth that's above the gum line, and it is covered in the hardest substance in the body, which is enamel. Enamel is harder than bone. The next line is pointing to a tissue called dentin, D-E-N-T-I-N. The dentin, which goes all the way around the crown and the root and the neck of a tooth, has a yellow color to it. So the enamel, as it wears down, the yellow appears behind it. And then the next line is pointing to a cavity inside of each tooth, which is known as the pulp cavity. Inside of the pulp cavity, we have blood vessels and a nerve supply. This is a model of the stomach. The stomach on the inside is separated into regions. So that's why I have some lines when I have region next to it, because I want you to label the region. That is what those lines are for. And then the other lines are pointing to something specific. It could be a valve, or it could be something that is curved, or something that is on the inside of the stomach. So we're going to start actually up here in the upper left-hand side. We'll do this line and continue on around counterclockwise, and then I'll start up here in the upper right and go clockwise. All right, so upper left first. We're going to start with this line. That first line is pointing to a valve. Another word for valve is sphincter. So this is pointing to a valve or sphincter between the esophagus and the stomach, and that is known as the cardiac sphincter or the cardiac valve, because that is the cardiac region of the stomach. All right, so that's the next question. The region, that is the cardiac region of the stomach. That is the first place that the food stuff that you have chewed up and swallowed will hit after it passes through the esophagus. It goes into the cardiac region. Now, this next line is pointing to a curve. There's two curves associated with the stomach. There's the lesser curvature and the greater curvature. The lesser curvature, which is next, is smaller than the greater curvature, which we'll see when we look at the structures on the right-hand side. The next line is pointing to the next valve or sphincter associated with the stomach. And this is the last valve before the foodstuff empties into the small intestine. This valve is known as the pyloric valve. All right, the next region is called the pyloric region. All right, and then we go to the next line. This is pointing to another curve which is larger than the lesser curve. This is known as the greater curvature. The next line is pointing to a region. This region is known as the body. The body is the largest part of the stomach, and that's where most digestion occurs inside of the stomach. If you notice on the inside surface of the stomach, it is not a flat surface. It kind of has that burnt flesh appearance to it. That type of groove and sulcus on the inner surface is called rugae. Alright, so this is the rugae inside of the stomach. Whenever the stomach fills with food stuff and expands, then the rugae will flatten out. But in an empty stomach, the rugae is really prominent. Alright, the next region is this upper region, and that is called the fundus, or fundic region, either way. Alright, so we have the pyloric region right here, pyloric valve right here, lesser curvature right here. We have the cardiac region right here, cardiac valve or sphincter right there, fundic region or fundus up here, rugae, it's on the inside here, it's where we have the folds of tissue on the inside, and then we have the body of the stomach, which is this main part of the stomach, and then the greater curvature actually starts up here, it goes all the way around. That's all greater curvature. If I go back to the lesser curvature, it starts right here, and it ends right there. Not very long compared to the greater curvature. All right, last slide for the digestive system. We're going to start on this line right here. It's pointing to this blood vessel, and then we're going to go clockwise around the liver. So we're going to start right here. That line is pointing to a vein. It is a really large vein that's passing up through the abdomen. This is the inferior vena cava. So that's the inferior vena cava. This next line is pointing to this green vessel. That is pointing to the bile duct. It's also known as the common bile duct. Either way, bile duct or common bile duct. This next line is pointing to a lobe of the liver. It is the right lobe of the liver. This next line is pointing to a vessel that goes from the bile duct to the gallbladder. That is known as the cystic duct. C-Y-S-T-I-C duct. All right, then this next line is pointing to the gallbladder. The next line is pointing to one of the lobes of the liver. This is called the quadrate lobe of the liver, and if you look at it, it kind of looks like a rectangle. A rectangular has 4 sides to it, but that is the quadrate lobe of the liver. The next line is pointing to the common hepatic duct. Before the common hepatic duct, there are 2 vessels known as the right hepatic duct and the left hepatic duct. The right hepatic duct is bringing bile from the right lobe or right side of the liver. The left hepatic duct is bringing bile from the left side of the liver. Well, they come together to form one common hepatic duct, and that is what this line is for. The common hepatic duct and the cystic duct come together to form the common bile duct. All right, let's go back to working our way around the liver. The next line, that's pointing to the left lobe of the liver. Then this next line is pointing to the hepatic artery. Hepatic means liver. So this is an artery bringing nutrient-rich blood into the liver. This is also oxygen-rich blood into the liver. The next vessel that is pointing to is a purple vessel, and that is known as the hepatic portal vein. Hepatic meaning liver, portal because it's part of a portal system, and it's the vein. It's bringing nutrient-rich and oxygen-poor blood into the liver. These nutrients are coming straight from the small intestine, spleen, pancreas, and the stomach. And the very last line is pointing to another lobe of the liver known as the caudate lobe. C-A-U-D-A-T-E. Caudate lobe of the liver. So there are 4 lobes to the liver. There's the right lobe, which is the largest lobe. There's the quadrate lobe. There's the left lobe. And then there's a caudate lobe. All right, that's all I have on the digestive system.